So, Michael's managed to lock Miss Browser in the store cupboard and then the class into the classroom. Is that going to be enough? Triumphant, he lay back against the wall to regain his breath, and just at that moment the headmaster came along the corridor. He was coming to tell Mr. Browser that a government inspector was coming down to the school in order to check on the marvellous progress of Class 8. "What's the matter, Michael?" he asked irritably, remembering that he threatened to have Michael transferred to another class. "Why aren't you in class? Has Mr. Browser turned you out?" "No, Mr. Salt." A brilliant idea had just come into Michael's head. It was as though the Brain Sharpeners had put it there. "I've just seen something strange in the field," he gasped out. "It's the Brain Sharpeners, Mr. Salt. Don't go out there. They're after Class 8 and Mr. Browser." "What's that banging?" demanded Mr. Salt, and Mr. Browser had redoubled his efforts to make someone free him. "I don't know, sir," replied Michael. Mr. Salt took a look inside the classroom and saw some of the class trying to force in the store cupboard door. "Where's Mr. Browser?" demanded the headmaster, all of his old suspicions of Mr. Browser flooding back. "I don't know," said Michael. "Perhaps the Brain Sharpeners have him, or perhaps he locked in that cupboard. If he doesn't come out soon, the Brain Sharpeners may go away." Mr. Salt pulled vainly at the handle of the classroom door, and Michael watched anxiously, for he knew in the back of his room Mr. Headmaster would have a headmaster key, and if he fetched that in time, it'd all be over. "The thing on the field looked like a pepper pot," mumbled Michael. Mr. Salt grew tired of struggling with the door and heard him. He didn't like being ordered about in his own school, particularly by children. Michael had told him not to go in the field. Very cheeky. "You're talking utter nonsense, boy," declared the headmaster. "I shall go out into the field, and when I have come back and found nothing, I shall, for the first time this term, take out my cane and use it." He strode off down the corridor, and Michael was glad to let him go, for it meant that there would be more delay before Class 8 could escape. And maybe the police would arrive in the field before Mr. Browser could bring the children there. Maybe, too, they would be there when Mr. Salt arrived. The banging inside the classroom became frantic, and it looked as though some of the boys were weakening in the store cupboard door. Michael moved out of sight along the corridor, and then decided to venture out into the playground to see what had happened to Mr. Salt. There was a strange light coming from the centre of the field, and then the whirring sound began again, as it had done when the pepper pot had taken off. The siren police car sounded nearby. The whirring sound became fainter, and the fog began to thin out. Two policemen appeared, running hard across the field. "Hi there, boy," one of them shouted. "Yes, take me to your headmaster," ordered the first policeman. "Steve, you carry on searching the field in case there's anything there," he added to his fellow policeman. Michael made a move towards the field, then checked himself. "He'll be in his room," he said. "This way." He led the policeman into the school and along the corridor to the office. From Class 8's room upstairs came a variety of banging and shouting noises. The policeman raised his eyebrows. "Their teacher's out," explained Michael. He took the policeman to the office door and knocked. "Please, Miss Coatwell, there's a policeman to see Mr. Salt," he announced. Miss Coatwell came to the door. "Mr. Salt's not here," she said. "He was going to look in at Class 8. "He's not there," said Michael. "Then I don't know where he is," said Miss Coatwell, who was used to spending considerable time each day searching for the headmaster. "Would you mind waiting? No doubt he'll be back in a minute. What's the matter?" "Not in front of the boy," said the policeman, looking down at Michael. "I'll go back to class," volunteered Michael. "Good boy," said Miss Coatwell. As Michael turned the corner and climbed the stairs, he heard the voice of Miss Toms quelling the noise from Class 8. "I'll fetch a cloth and break the glass," she called out. Michael ran along the corridor. "Don't do that, Miss Toms. I have the key," he shouted. "You? What are you doing with the key, Michael?" "I went to fetch it, miss," said Michael, smiling at her. "You see, I was late, and—" "Open it up, then," demanded Miss Toms. Michael obeyed, and when Miss Toms entered the classroom, all the children moved back to their seats automatically. "Where's Mr. Browser?" asked Miss Toms. Loud knockings from the cupboard door gave her the answer. "Who has the key?" she demanded. "I have," answered Michael. For once, Michael did not allow Miss Thoms to finish the sentence, but went and opened the store cupboard. Mr. Browser, coat off and his tie awry, shot out like a rabbit from its burrow. "Class 8, he commanded. "Out in line at once." "Where are you going?" asked the confused Miss Toms, and when Mr. Browser saw her, he also became confused. "It's too late, Mr. Browser, they've gone," said Michael. Mr. Browser stared at him. "Are you sure?" "Quite sure, Mr. Browser. I heard them taking off. The fog's lifted and there's nothing on the field." "That's true," said Mr. Browser, looking out the window. The sun was trying to break through the low clouds. Mr. Browser wiped his forehead with a duster he had found in the cupboard. "Who's gone where?" demanded Miss Toms, who hated not being in control of the situation. "Never mind, Miss Toms," said Mr. Browser with sudden firmness. "Thank you for your help. I can look after everything from now. Class 8, take out your books. Sit down, Michael. Read quietly, everybody. Whatever you like." Miss Toms edged out sideways, wondering whether she ought to report all this mysterious behaviour to Mr. Salt. Michael sat down, and to his surprise saw that Spiky Jackson was reading a comic and grinning all over his face, happy as a man who had been on a desert island for months and had just seen a ship coming towards him. Michael looked around him, and there was Anna Cardwell playing quietly with a tiny doll she found at the bottom of her desk, where it had been lying untouched since the arrival of the Brain Sharpeners. "Spiky," whispered Michael, "shouldn't you be getting on with some work? You're wasting time with that comic." Spiky looked up briefly and winked. "You're a fine one to talk," and he returned to the comic. Michael was congratulating himself that the class was coming out of the spell put on them by the Brain Sharpeners when Miss Cotwell came along the corridor with Miss Toms and the policeman. "Excuse me, Mr. Browser," said Miss Toms. "Has anyone seen Mr. Salt? He is said to have come this way." Michael's hand shot up. "Please, Mr. Browser, Mr. Salt went out onto the field." "Indeed," said Mr. Browser. "Carry on with your work, Class 8. Looking very grave, he set off with Miss Toms, Miss Cotwell, and the policeman from the field. "We had this report made by a child, we think," the policeman was saying. 5 minutes later they all came back, without the headmaster. The policeman went to the office with Miss Toms to discuss the strange disappearance of Mr. Salt. Mr. Browser re-entered the classroom as Spiky Jackson launched the first dart he had thrown since the Brain Sharpeners had set him to work. It glided through the air, then swooped and landed on Mr. Browser's desk. The whole class looked up in anxious expectation. "Simon Jackson," said Mr. Browser, picking up the dart, "that's quite a well-made dart. Yes, it's the best I've seen for a while. It's nice to know you haven't forgotten how to make them. But no more of them, please." Spiky Jackson's mouth opened wide. Then a grin spread all over his face. "Thanks, Mr. Browser," he said. "I think," went on Mr. Browser, "that we'll have a change of lessons this afternoon. We'll go out to games. We haven't been out for weeks owing to the weather, so I think you deserve a long lesson." Class 8 came back to life, for everyone now knew that Mr. Browser had also escaped from the clutches of the Brain Sharpeners. "Hurrah for Mr. Browser!" cried Jason Little, and everyone joined in the cheering. "No more homework for a while," added Mr. Browser. "Maybe we've been overdoing it lately." Michael marvelled at the smooth way in which Mr. Browser dismissed the Brain Sharpeners from his mind, even blaming the lack of games lessons on the weather. He decided it would be wise not to bring up the subject for a while, though there were questions he wanted to ask. Policemen in uniform were replaced later on the day by important-looking men in plain clothes, but there was no sign of the headmaster. Later in the afternoon, one of the plain-clothes men asked Michael questions in the presence of Miss Tom. "You said you saw Mr. Salt go out into the field." "I saw him going along the corridor in that direction. He said he was going out to the field." "Did he say why?" "No," said Michael. He had decided that unless Mr. Browser was going to talk, he would say nothing at all about the Brain Sharpeners. It was surely best to let sleeping dogs lie. That evening, the parents of the children in Class 8 were surprised to find their sons and daughters wanted to play or watch television all the time instead of working. At first they were shocked and disappointed, but gradually they began to admit that they were pleased their children were back to normal, even if it did mean there were often more trouble to them. At school, Mr. Browser became his old self, demanding reasonable work but not being fanatical about it. Once or twice, Michael approached him with the idea of asking him about the Brain Sharpeners, but each time Mr. Browser sent him away because he was busy. As for Mr. Salt, the headmaster had disappeared, and there wasn't a clue as to his whereabouts. There were plenty of rumours, and there was a report in the local paper stating that maybe it was overwork which had made Mr. Salt vanish so completely. His wife declared he'd been ever so happy at home. A fortnight went by as though the Brain Sharpers had never existed. Yet the continued absence of Mr. Salt was a constant reminder to Michael of all that had happened, and at last he could no longer remain silent. He chose a time at the end of the school day when Mr. Browser was alone at his desk, and took him by surprise by doubling back from the door instead of following the others out. "Please, Mr. Browser, do you think Mr. Salt will ever come back?" he asked. "If they were just sharpening up his brain for use on us, he would have been back by now, wouldn't he?" Mr. Browser at first put on his aloof look, but Michael's determined appearance persuaded him to talk. "I think you're right, Michael," he agreed. "I'm sure that Mr. Salt's the very sort of man they needed to develop their new territories. It won't be a surprise to me if he became a sort of Minister of Education on Planet 5, if they managed to sharpen his brains up enough. They couldn't very well let him come back after their attempt to sharpen up our brains had failed, so they cut their losses and made off with him. They might send him back to some other town to recruit other suitable people for brain sharpening. But that depends on how long they're prepared to keep their space platform in its present position. If they take it back to their own galaxy, they won't be back here for hundreds of thousands of years. That's my guess." "Then we're safe, Mr. Browser?" "I think so, but we must always be on our guard in case they do turn up in some form or other." But to this day there had been no sign from the headmaster or from the Brain Sharpeners. Miss Tom was appointed headmistress in Mr. Salt's place, and Mr. Browser became deputy headmaster. The inspector invited when Mr. Salt arrived and found the children no cleverer or stupider than the children of most other schools, and went away saying that Mr. Salt must have been a little deranged before he vanished into thin air. So life returned to normal at Chevy Chase School, and so far there's no sign that the Brain Sharpeners have yet struck in any other school. So if you like that, there's a whole series of them, and you can buy them from most any booksellers online, and hopefully you enjoyed it.